There comes a moment in every situation built on deception when the truth becomes heavier to carry than the lie itself. You may not know exactly what your ex has been hiding, and you don't need to. The deeper principle is this: anything that requires constant maintenance eventually becomes difficult to sustain. A false story requires explanations. An explanation requires another explanation, and eventually the person who created the illusion becomes trapped inside it. Think about what happens psychologically when someone knows they are not being completely honest. They may appear confident. They may laugh, move forward, post pictures, build new relationships, and convince everyone around them that everything is fine. But appearance and reality are two different worlds. You can control what people see for a while, but you cannot permanently control the consequences of what you do. That is why you should stop exhausting yourself trying to uncover every hidden detail. When you constantly ask, what did they do? What are they hiding? Who knows the truth? You unknowingly allow that person to continue occupying space in your mind. Your attention becomes the currency you keep paying for a relationship that has already ended. And this is where emotional strength begins. You don't need to become a detective. You don't need to expose them. You don't need to convince everyone that you were right. There is tremendous power in understanding that truth does not always need your assistance. Sometimes reality reveals itself through patterns, consequences, contradictions, and time. People can control a conversation, but they cannot control every consequence. They can manipulate one person's perception, but they cannot manipulate everyone's perception forever. They can create an image, but they cannot guarantee that the image will survive contact with reality. Perhaps this is what makes hidden truth so powerful. It doesn't always arrive dramatically. Sometimes it appears quietly. Someone remembers a conversation differently. Someone notices a contradiction. A behavior repeats itself. A story stops making sense. A person who once seemed trustworthy begins revealing another side of themselves. And suddenly, what was confusing becomes clear. But here's the deeper lesson for you. Don't build your healing around the expectation that their secret will be exposed. Because if your peace depends on their downfall, then they still have control over you. You have to reach a higher level of freedom. You have to be able to say, even if the world never discovers everything that happened, I know what I experienced. I know what I learned. I know who I am becoming. That is maturity. Revenge asks, when will they suffer? Wisdom asks, what will I become because I survived this? Those are completely different questions. The first keeps you emotionally attached to the past. The second moves you toward the future. And sometimes the most unexpected thing happens when you stop waiting for justice to arrive in the form you imagined. You become so focused on rebuilding yourself that their actions lose their emotional power. The person you once needed answers from becomes someone you no longer need anything from. That is when the chapter truly begins to close. So if you've been sensing that something about their story doesn't add up, don't let curiosity become obsession. Don't chase information at the expense of your peace. Let time reveal what time reveals. Your responsibility is not to manage their consequences. Your responsibility is to manage your character, your choices, your boundaries, and the direction of your life. Because eventually every person has to live with the truth of who they are, and you have a choice about who you become after discovering who they were. Let the truth expose them, but let your growth transform you. Now consider what happens when the image someone has carefully constructed begins to crack. This is where many people make a mistake. They see an ex appearing happy, confident, successful, or completely unaffected, and they assume that appearance tells them everything they need to know. But human beings are remarkably capable of constructing an external identity that has very little relationship to their internal reality. Someone can look completely composed while privately experiencing fear. Someone can appear successful while being deeply dissatisfied. Someone can speak confidently while constantly worrying that the truth they have hidden will eventually be discovered. The outside world sees the performance. The individual knows the reality behind it, and maintaining that difference requires energy. Psychologically, whenever a person has to protect an image that contradicts their behavior, tension begins to develop. They have to remember what they told one person, what they told another, what version of events they presented, and which details they must avoid. The more complicated the deception becomes, the more difficult it becomes to maintain consistency. Eventually, the cracks don't necessarily appear because someone dramatically exposes them. Sometimes the cracks appear through behavior. A person becomes defensive when simple questions are asked. They become unusually angry when certain subjects are mentioned. Their explanations constantly change. They distance themselves from people who know too much. They create new narratives to replace old ones. They may even try harder than ever to prove how happy they are. And that's something worth understanding. Sometimes excessive performance is itself a signal of internal instability. When someone is genuinely at peace, they usually don't need to constantly convince everyone that they are at peace. They simply live. But when identity depends heavily on external approval, the person may become obsessed with controlling perception. This is not about assuming that every strange behavior means your ex is hiding something. That's important. You don't want to turn uncertainty into certainty without evidence. The deeper lesson is about human nature. Reality eventually demands consistency. You can tell people who you are, but eventually your repeated choices tell the story for you. You can say you're loyal, but your actions reveal whether you are. You can say you're honest, but patterns reveal whether you are. You can say you've changed, but time reveals whether the change is real. And this is why you don't have to participate in the destruction of someone's image. If their identity was built on something false, reality will eventually challenge it. Your role is not to stand outside their life waiting for the collapse. Your role is to step away from the emotional theater completely. Because there is another danger here, becoming addicted to watching someone who hurt you fail. At first, you may tell yourself, I just want the truth to come out. But gradually that can become, I need to see what happens to them. Then it becomes, I need them to regret losing me. And suddenly your emotional freedom is still connected to their behavior. That's not freedom. Freedom is when their image no longer matters to you. Whether they succeed or fail, you remain committed to your own growth. Whether people understand what happened or misunderstand it, you continue walking forward. Whether your ex admits the truth or never does, you refuse to abandon your peace. And paradoxically, that is often when the greatest transformation occurs. You stop needing their collapse because you've already risen beyond the version of yourself that needed their validation. The person who once had the power to break your heart no longer has the power to determine your direction. So don't chase the cracks in their image. Build something so authentic within yourself that you no longer need to watch someone else's illusion fall apart. Let their mask become their problem. Your future is your responsibility. Sometimes the hardest part of a painful relationship is not what you know. It is what you never understood. You remember the moments when their behavior suddenly changed. You remember the unexplained distance, the contradictions, the excuses that never quite made sense. You remember asking yourself, why did they treat me this way? And because you never received a satisfying answer, your mind kept returning to the same questions. But here's something psychologically important. The human mind hates incomplete stories. When something doesn't make sense, your brain continues searching for an explanation. It replays conversations, it examines small details, it remembers the exact moment someone's tone changed. It asks whether you missed a warning sign. And if you're not careful, you can spend months or even years trying to solve a mystery that the other person deliberately created. That's why discovering a hidden truth can feel so powerful. Suddenly, scattered pieces begin connecting. The strange behavior has context. The unexplained distance has meaning. The sudden change in affection makes more sense. The things you once interpreted as personal rejection may have had far more to do with what was happening inside their world. And this is where you need to be careful. Understanding the truth can bring closure, but speculation is not the same thing as truth. You cannot heal by inventing explanations simply because they make the past easier to understand. Real closure is built on reality, not imagination. Maybe there was something they concealed. Maybe there were choices they didn't tell you about. Maybe there were fears, insecurities, or motives they never had the courage to communicate. Whatever the reality was, your task now is not to manufacture certainty. Your task is to recognize that confusion itself was information. Think about that. If you repeatedly had to question where you stood, if their words and actions constantly contradicted each other, if you felt like you were trying to understand a person who refused to communicate honestly, that experience mattered. You don't need to minimize it simply because you cannot explain every detail. One of the greatest psychological traps after a painful breakup is believing that closure requires the other person to confess everything. You think, if they would just tell me the truth, I could finally move on. But what happens if they never do? Does that mean you remain trapped forever? Absolutely not. Your healing cannot be dependent on someone else's honesty. Sometimes closure is not receiving the final explanation. Sometimes closure is accepting that the behavior itself gave you enough information to make a different decision about your future. You don't need to know every chapter of someone's hidden story to recognize that you deserve a relationship built on transparency. And when the truth eventually becomes visible, don't allow yourself to become obsessed with saying, "I knew it." Instead, let the truth teach you something. Let it sharpen your discernment. Let it teach you to pay attention to patterns rather than promises. Let it remind you that love should not require you to constantly negotiate with confusion, because mature love does not thrive on secrecy. It thrives on honesty, accountability, consistency, and trust. Maybe one day you'll look back and realize that the thing you thought was destroying you was actually revealing something you desperately needed to learn about yourself. You learned what you will no longer tolerate. You learned that chemistry is not character. You learned that words without consistent actions mean very little. And most importantly, you learned that losing someone is not always the same as losing your future. Sometimes what leaves your life creates the space for something healthier to enter it. So if the truth about your ex eventually comes out, let it confirm what you have already learned, not control what you do next. You don't need every hidden answer to choose a better future. Sometimes the pattern was the answer. There is a moment in healing when you have to make a very difficult decision. Are you waiting for justice, or are you choosing freedom? Because those two things can look similar from a distance, but psychologically, they lead you in completely different directions. When someone hurts you, especially someone you trusted deeply, it is natural to want consequences. You want them to understand what they did. You want them to regret it. You want the people around them to finally recognize what happened. And perhaps most of all, you want your ex to experience the same emotional weight they caused you to carry. But here's the uncomfortable truth. If your happiness depends on their suffering, then they still have power over you. You may have ended the relationship physically, but emotionally you're still connected to them through resentment. You're still checking whether they are doing well or badly. You're still wondering whether they miss you. You're still imagining the moment they finally realize what they lost. That isn't freedom. That's attachment wearing the disguise of revenge. Real freedom begins when you stop requiring a particular outcome from the person who hurt you. You can acknowledge that what happened was wrong without dedicating your future to proving it. You can recognize betrayal without becoming bitter. You can remember the pain without allowing it to become your identity. This is where emotional strength becomes more than simply moving on. Moving on is not pretending you weren't hurt. It is not forgetting what happened. It is not convincing yourself that everything was okay. It is taking the experience and refusing to let it dictate the person you become, because pain gives you a choice. You can allow it to make you suspicious of everyone, or you can allow it to make you wiser. You can allow betrayal to convince you that nobody can be trusted, or you can use it to develop stronger boundaries and better judgment. You can spend years asking, how could they do this to me? Or you can eventually ask the more powerful question, what can I learn from this that will protect the person I am becoming? That second question changes everything. Imagine waking up one day and realizing you don't care whether your ex regrets leaving you. You don't need them to call. You don't need an apology. You don't need them to admit they were wrong. You don't need their new relationship to fail. You don't need their friends to suddenly take your side. You simply want peace. That is a level of emotional independence many people never reach because they remain addicted to external validation. They believe their worth will be restored when the person who hurt them finally recognizes their value. But your worth was never determined by their ability to recognize it. Someone's inability to appreciate you does not reduce your value. Someone's dishonesty does not make you less deserving of honesty. Someone's decision to leave does not mean you are unworthy of being chosen, and someone else's downfall does not need to become the foundation of your happiness. Let consequences belong to the person who created them. Your responsibility is to build your character, build your confidence, build your relationships, build your purpose. Build a life so aligned with your values that the past no longer has the authority to interrupt your peace. And perhaps one day, when you hear that your ex is struggling, exposed, or finally facing consequences, you'll discover something surprising. You won't feel victorious. You'll simply feel free. Wait for their collapse to begin your rise. Start rising now. And then, there is another possibility you need to understand. When the truth finally becomes visible, people may begin seeing the entire story differently. Not because you spent months defending yourself, not because you convinced everyone to take your side, but because reality has a way of changing the meaning of the past. Think about how often people judge a situation from incomplete information. They hear one person's version, they see one person's behavior, they assume they understand what happened. Perhaps your ex presented themselves as the victim. Perhaps they told people a carefully edited version of the breakup. Perhaps you stayed quiet because you didn't want to expose private details or turn your pain into public entertainment. And silence can be misunderstood. People sometimes mistake silence for guilt. They mistake composure for indifference. They assume that the person who speaks first must be the person who is telling the truth. But being first to tell a story does not make someone the author of reality. Eventually, patterns have a way of becoming visible. Maybe someone notices inconsistencies. Maybe another person experiences the same behavior you once experienced. Maybe a conversation reveals something that contradicts the story they told. Maybe circumstances simply make it impossible to maintain the same image. And suddenly, people begin looking backward. They remember things you said. They remember moments they didn't understand. They remember the way you withdrew without explaining everything. And what once looked confusing begins to make sense. But here's where your character matters. When that moment comes, resist the temptation to say, "I told you so." You may have every reason to say it. You may have spent months feeling misunderstood. You may have wanted people to finally recognize that your perspective was legitimate. But there is a difference between being vindicated and becoming obsessed with vindication. Vindication is something that happens. Freedom is something you choose. If the truth comes out, let it speak for itself. You don't have to turn someone's exposure into a public celebration. You don't need to humiliate them. You don't need to gather people around and replay every detail. You don't need to prove that you were the better person. Because if you truly healed, you won't need an audience for your healing. This is a profound psychological shift. In the beginning, you may want everyone to understand your pain because you want confirmation that your experience was real. But eventually, you learn that your experience does not become more real because other people validate it. You know what you lived through. You know what you tolerated. You know how many nights you questioned yourself. You know how hard it was to walk away. And that knowledge can be enough. There is also something powerful that happens when people finally recognize your character after previously misunderstanding you. They begin to realize that your silence wasn't weakness. Your distance wasn't hatred. Your decision to leave wasn't impulsive. Perhaps you were protecting your dignity. Perhaps you were protecting your peace. Perhaps you simply reached the point where explaining yourself became more exhausting than walking away. And that is a lesson worth carrying into every future relationship. Never build your identity around other people's interpretations of you. People will misunderstand you. Some will believe rumors. Some will hear only one side. Some will judge you without asking questions. And if you spend your entire life trying to correct every misunderstanding, you will never have enough energy left to live. Let your consistency become your explanation. Let your character become your evidence. Let time reveal what words cannot. Because eventually people don't just remember what you said. They remember how you behaved over time. And when the truth finally changes the way others see the past, don't look backward with bitterness. Look forward with gratitude. Not because you enjoyed what happened, but because you survived it without becoming what hurt you. When the truth speaks for itself, you don't need to shout. Just keep walking in the truth.